Hello and welcome to Integral Centering, where we explore pathways to wholeness and self-discovery for every stage of life. I'm Robert Strohmeyer, and with me today is Ron Pevny. Ron Pevny is the founder of the Center for Conscious Eldering and the author of Conscious Living, Conscious Aging, Claiming the Gifts of Elderhood. Ron is a central figure in the conscious aging movement, and I am very grateful to have him with me here today for this conversation. Ron, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Bob. It's an honor to be with you today.
I am so excited to talk with you today because we get so much feedback and engagement with people who are going through life stages that I would consider deeply aligned with conscious eldering, people who are experiencing eldering and wrestling with the moments of disconnection and transformation and reorientation that this period of life calls for. And I have absolutely loved your book. And I had the pleasure of attending a seminar, a 2-day seminar that you gave just a couple of weeks ago. And I came away from both the book and that seminar wondering how it was that you got the inspiration to pursue this path of helping others to navigate elderhood. And in particular, this sense of saging
Mhm.
as wisdom keepers. What was that journey like for you?
Well, Bob, I think the journey began, at least in a conscious way for me, probably when I was 30 years old. And I had just completed my graduate education at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And frankly, I felt pretty lost. I really didn't feel like my calling was to be a counselor, even though that's what I was trained in. But then I had the good fortune to meet two mentors, Stephen Foster and Meredith Little, who are well known around the world for being the people perhaps most responsible for helping to introduce the concept of rites of passage to the modern non-Indigenous world. I became their student. They were my mentors. And when that happened, when I was about 30 years old, all of a sudden, I got that incredible clarity that my work, my calling, my purpose was to help people move through life transitions, help them navigate transition in a way where they actually use transition for growth, because transition is full of potential for growth. And so after I finished my training with them, I began in Colorado, which is my home. I began one of the first modern day wilderness rite of passage programs. And I did that work for a bunch of years. I did some other things along the way also, because rites of passage guides don't make much of a living usually. I had to do corporate training in the area of creativity and other things of that sort. But I always knew that my calling was to help people to use nature, especially to help open their hearts and minds to the possibilities of their transitions. And so I led a lot of wilderness rites of passage, a lot of wilderness vision quests. Did that for a lot of years while I was doing other work to make a living. And then about the year 2000, and I was in my very early 50s. A couple of wise elders, 15 years wiser and elder than me, who knew about my work, invited me to join them in creating some kind of a program that could serve as a rite of passage into elderhood. Because there were various of us by this time offering rites of passage kind of in general for people going through major transitions. But there wasn't anything explicitly geared toward the journey from midlife adulthood into elderhood. And so here I was with these two wise elders, and I'm this young guy. But I learned so much from working with them and from the committed people that joined us on the retreats that we started to offer. People who knew that there must be some kind of an empowering vision for aging, but they couldn't find it around us in our society. And at first I felt like an imposter. I was too young. I hadn't had the experience. But as the years went by, I began to learn more and more from them and from other mentors. And then as I ended up having a life-changing health crisis where I could have died, boy, it's amazing what that does to focus you and help you to see what you're really about and what's most important. At that particular point, I realized that I was now ready to claim my role as somebody who could help people move into a conscious elderhood. And my two original partners ended up aging out, if you will, for being able to do the work. They passed the torch to me. And in 2010, I started the Center for Conscious Eldering. We offer retreats. I do writing. It's my passion. It's my calling, not just to share this with others, but it's my passion and calling in terms of my own growth. Because I know in my gut that I don't have any credibility in serving as a teacher or guide to others if I'm not committed to doing the same kind of work that I'm sharing with them. So I'm deeply passionate about aging consciously for myself, and I'm passionate about sharing what I learn along the way with others.
Ron, you touched on something that has a lot of significance for me personally. I've spent years studying rites of passage, and in particular, initiation rites and the initiatic traditions in a variety of cultural contexts, indigenous cultures, Western esoteric cultures. And there are many rites of passage, many variations on the rite of passage from youth to adulthood.
Yes.
It's almost as though there is this missing rite of passage, right? And you talk about it in your book this way, right? That there's a need for a rite of passage into elderhood. That's something that shakes the mind awake into this new consciousness. What is that?
The passage from youth to adulthood is huge. It's a major transition in one's life in the outer world, but even more, it's a major transition in one's inner life. The passage from midlife adulthood, of being oriented toward career, toward work, from that into elderhood is just as momentous, I think, in terms of one's external life and in terms of one's inner growth, inner movement. They're both incredibly momentous. And what's been missing is some kind of an empowering initiation ceremony to at least help people to move along into elderhood. Because elderhood is indeed, Bob, it is a life stage, a stage in the development of the psyche. It's possible for all of us. It's an archetypal call in us to grow into elderhood rather than just growing old. But it takes support. It takes support from us consciously doing work that can help open us to those possibilities. It really takes support from the world around us, which is sorely lacking. And so at least some kind of a process or program that can help people feel some of this support so that they can start to bring forth the elder in them is, I think, really critical. And I feel privileged to be one of those who's able to have the calling to provide that support for people.
You call out the distinction between elderhood and growing old.
Mhm.
What does that distinction mean for you?
Elderhood is very much about growing as we age. And anybody can grow old. All you have to do is just sit around, and every day you're going to grow old. But growing in in our potential to allow spirit to move and work through us, in our potential to be empathic, compassionate beings, in our potential to access the kind of wisdom that we can share with younger people, which has always been the role of elder. It requires growth to grow into that potential. And that growth requires some work. And that's why the conscious aging work, conscious eldering work, and I use the terms almost synonymously, it's work that really, it's on the fringes. It may never become mainstream because it's work for people who have some sense of what growth is and that their fulfillment as they age is going to require growth. And I think we live in a world that has no sense whatsoever of what personal and emotional growth and spiritual growth is. And so for most people, it's hard to relate to it. But I'll bet that the kind of people who listen to your interviews, kind of people you know, and the kind of people I know are people who are committed to their growth. And they're looking for ways to grow and to use the wonderful time after quote unquote retirement age, when we have more time, less responsibilities in most cases, to use that as an opportunity for growth. I really believe that elderhood can be the pinnacle of our emotional and our spiritual growth, Bob. The pinnacle. That's the purpose of elderhood. When our ego's tasks have largely been left behind, now it's a chance to grow inwardly, but it takes some work. And that's what conscious eldering is about.
An emphasis on the conscious. I think that, first of all, I work with a lot of people who are in late stage career and find themselves really trying to find that thread of meaning again in what they're doing with their lives. And one of the phrases I hear over and over again from people who are in their late 50s and early 60s is, I'm still trying to figure out what I'm going to be when I grow up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that the frequency of that specific phrase, that what I want to be when I grow up, that sense of we've all achieved adulthood somehow, but many of us are still trying to grow up. What's that relationship between conscious eldering and really finally growing up?
I think there's a big difference between asking ourselves and focusing on what do I want to be when I grow up and who do I want to be when I grow up. One has to do with outer activity. The other has to do with who this person is going to be who chooses whatever outer activity we're going to do as we age. And conscious eldering is very much about focusing on who we're going to be, what kind of a person we're going to be, so that whatever it is that we feel is our purpose, our contribution in our later years, what can give us meaning in the world, so that we can be capable of fulfilling those aspirations. It's one thing to aspire to all kinds of stuff, but if we're carrying around a lot of old baggage, old habits, old ways of thinking and being, old wounding, the baggage that we all carry around, if we're carrying that with us, that doesn't matter what we would like to be, that's going to be sapping a lot of our energy and compromising our ability to truly make a difference and be fulfilled. And so focusing on the kind of person we want to be, while also making sure that we are doing our best to discover what our sense of purpose is now, in our later years, is that's how we're going to age well. That's how we're going to bring forth the elder in us rather than just growing old.
For the purposes of this conversation, we're not going to be able to go in depth into the entire process and the entire framework of conscious eldering. But my hope is that you'll be willing to come back and do a deeper dive into some elements of this with us. But for this audience today, could you give us an overview of what the framework, what that process looks like? So I'm going to say from conception, right? From when you begin to realize
Mm-hmm.
that you're entering elderhood through, what are the rites of passage? What does that journey look like? What are the markers on that journey? What is the neutral zone?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we learn to inhabit our elder identity with presence and growth?
Well, common to rites of passage or rites of initiation around the world, there are certain key dynamics that our psyches go through if we're going to truly make the passage and not just somehow remain stuck in the past. When we're thinking of elderhood in particular, the dynamic is very much about being willing to take a look at who we have been up to now. Life review is a critical component of the inner work of conscious eldering. Who have we been up to now? What have we learned? What kind of baggage are we still carrying around that needs to be healed? A lot of us need to do work with forgiveness or with grief or with identifying some of that shadow stuff we've been carrying around, old habits and ways of being that don't serve us. So the first dynamic really is getting in touch with who we have been, what needs to be released or needs to be healed. What are those qualities that are precious and that define us that need to be carried forward so that we have some clarity about the self that we're leaving behind and some of which what we need to take into the next step. Now, the second dynamic in all major transition and all rites of passage, second dynamic is called the neutral zone, or it has names like liminal space, or it's sometimes called the fertile void. I like that, a nice poetic. But anyway, in all major transitions, once we've done a lot of the work of letting go of a stage that we have been in, we enter a neutral zone, which is an in-between time. And it's a necessary in-between time. It's that time when the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis and waits. And when you look at this chrysalis, you can't even tell that it was a caterpillar, but it waits for the seeds of possibility to start to germinate and stir. And out of that comes the beginnings of the next chapter, the next edition of ourself that's waiting to emerge. The neutral zone is probably the most important thing, I think, for so many of us people in the industrialized world to understand and to be willing to embrace. Because it is a time that can last anywhere from a few months to longer. We can't control it. It's a time when we feel lost. We know that somehow we're no longer who we have been. We don't have any clarity about who we're becoming. A lot of shadow stuff comes up. A lot of dark stuff that we haven't really dealt with because we've been too busy, dealing with the previous stage, making a living in the case of aging. A lot of difficult stuff comes up for us to look at. But if we use that time well, and it's a wonderful, wonderful time for us to spend a lot of time in quiet, a lot of time in nature, a lot of time using our spiritual resources, whatever those might be for us, a lot of time trying to tap into some of our creative energy. That's a time when we can begin to see seeds, get glimpses of the next edition of ourself that wants to emerge. We start to get glimpses among all the other challenging things that come with the neutral zone. And gradually, if we approach this with trust and confidence and keeping ourselves as open as we can and don't give in to despair, which is easy to get into, and darkness, gradually we're going to begin to see that, wow, these glimpses of what's possible are more and more numerous. And all of a sudden, one day we think, wow, something has changed. Somehow I'm beginning to have a sense of a new identity that's starting to emerge for me. And gradually that gets stronger until we can really say that, yeah, I have somehow moved into a new stage. That is so true with this journey into elderhood. I think so many people get lost in who don't understand any of these things because our culture doesn't teach us anything about the dynamics of transition. So many people retire. They get thrust into the neutral zone. They feel lost and they don't see any possibilities for ever emerging. And I think that's why there is so much depression and substance abuse and anxiety and other things that characterize so many older adults. If we learn how to use all these dynamics well, especially the neutral zone, then we can trust that, yeah, we're going to emerge and something very positive is going to emerge. We will have grown. we will have more to give to the world in new ways than we did before. And so, in a nutshell, Bob, that is the process of transition. And that is the kind of rite of passage that we each need to go through in our own way, because we don't have society-wide rites of passage like a lot of cultures used to. But that's the kind of work that I do. Teaching conscious eldering helps us to see some of the things we need to be doing. And the kind of retreats I do give people at least a short, week-long immersion in this whole process of the rite of passage. And I think that that's critical for a lot of people. If we're looking for an empowering vision for how we can age, then I think that this is the most empowering vision that I can imagine.
The neutral zone, that liminal space, it appears that it is something we are all either currently doing or going to experience, right? We're inevitably going to go through that period of liminality, that in between state. And you beautifully touched on that sense of darkness and despair that can emerge, that almost inevitably at some point emerges in the neutral zone.
Yes.
What advice do you give to someone who may recognize the sound of that from their own recent life experience, from where they're feeling right now? What do you say to someone who thinks they might be there today?
I encourage people to keep the faith. I encourage people to find others to share this journey of growth into elderhood with. Because a lot of people are going through these same dynamics. And if we try to do it alone, it is so easy to feel lost, screwed up, unsupported. But when we see that other people are going through the same kind of thing, it makes all the difference in the world in supporting each other, in keeping faith, in keeping trust. And then again, like I said, this is the time for trying to quiet down our lives a bit. It's not the time for being out there. So many people, I'm sure you and your listeners have heard, and I've heard a million times, people say, oh, I retire and I am busier now than I've ever been in my life, like a badge of honor. But perhaps that isn't the time to be busier than you've ever been in your life. Perhaps it's a time for a while to allow yourself to be quieter than you've ever been. Give yourself some equivalent of a gap year. Most people know what that is. A quiet space when you don't have to be doing much of anything and you can just be doing inner exploring. It's a time for exploration. The neutral zone is not a time for making long-term commitments. It's a time for exploring some possibilities, maybe through some volunteer activities, taking classes, maybe trying some part-time things, just to kind of see what's bringing you alive. Do it as an experiment, because the whole key to a new beginning is gradually emerging into a state of feeling more and more aliveness. That's a true elderhood, is feeling aliveness and the sense of purpose and meaning, that and aliveness that comes with being an elder. And you got to be quiet and you got to give yourself space for that to emerge. And I don't teach or advocate any particular way of deepening our spiritual lives. Everybody has to find their own way. I'm sure all of your listeners have their ways, but use that, rely on that more than you ever have, as a way of getting in touch with that still small voice within that can give you clues as to what wants to emerge when you move into your elderhood.
And you support this process through workshops at the center, through retreats in a couple of different locations, yes? What does the retreat format look like, and how do you overtly foster these rites of passage in that experience?
Well, the signature retreat that we're best known for is a week-long retreat called Choosing Conscious Elderhood. They happen in different locations. We don't do a lot, maybe do 3, maybe 4 a year. The place where we have done the most is an incredibly magnificent Ghost Ranch, New Mexico. And I'm sure many of your listeners know of Ghost Ranch, if nothing else from Georgia O'Keeffe's incredible artwork there. It gives us an opportunity to be in a location where, even though we sleep and we have meeting places indoors, there's the magnificent beauty and power of the natural world around us, which is so important, I think, in what we do. And in that context, we divide the week so that we divide it into 3 segments, if you will. And the first segment very much focuses on this first dynamic of transition, looking at our lives up to now, who we have been, what needs to be healed, what needs to be let go, that kind of an exploration. And then the second segment is largely centered around a full day and a little bit of time on both ends of that, when people are alone in the natural world with no structure. We've provided a lot of guidance, but it's up to them just to be there in the neutral zone, if you will, getting in touch with their inner voice as best they can, probably getting in touch with a bunch of the dark stuff that also wants to rear its head, but just being there in that space and seeing what it's like. And a lot of people find in that one day that they have some incredibly meaningful experiences. And then the last third of the retreat, roughly, is focused on what is your best sense right now of what's wanting to emerge. And you may not have much of a sense. You may be very much in the neutral zone. But most of us, even when we're there, we have some kind of a sense of what wants to emerge. So what do we know about that? How can we be intentional in moving toward vision, whether it's ill-formed or whether we have a pretty strong vision? How can we be intentional in living into the vision of what's possible for us in our elder years? Very much focused on intentionality, because without intentionality, we're just going to drift.
What does it look like to come out the other side of this process, to emerge from the neutral zone, to emerge from that chrysalis? How does a person know that they've passed through it?
It's an inner knowing. And I think perhaps the more conscious we are, the more we've been on the path of growth, the more we're in touch with inner knowings. It's just an inner knowing that something has shifted. I really feel like something has shifted and I'm beginning to move into a new stage. Just this inner knowing. And then we start to reinforce that by living more intentionally and purposefully. And all of a sudden we feel, yeah, something has changed. But one thing I think it's really important, Bob, to point out, especially when we get into the later chapters of our life, it's not like we retire, we go through a difficult neutral zone, we move into elderhood, and then we just coast along until it's time to die. The fact of the matter is that there are going to be lots of difficult transitions in our elderhood, more than there were when we were younger. There are going to be losses. There are going to be diseases. There are going to be losses of friends. There's going to be a lot of things. And each of them has its own, it's like a mini transition with a lot of the same dynamics. And so the better we have learned as we move into elderhood to deal with loss, to gracefully let go of what it's time to let go of, to be in these neutral zones, even if they're mini neutral zones, if you will, the better we have learned that, the better we're going to be able to deal with what in many ways feels like almost constant transition in our elderhood, because that's the reality of how it is. We're in a new life stage, but within that, we're going to be undergoing a lot of changes, a lot of times when we feel cracked open. But each of those times when we feel cracked open is another opportunity to let more of the light of spirit and passion into us. And this is all going to prepare us for that final big passage. And the better prepared we are for that final passage, the better off we're going to be in our final days. And maybe after, who knows what's after. But many of the world's wisdom traditions say that the state we're in when we're on the bridge, on that bridge between the worlds, very much determines what's going to be next.
Ron Pevny, thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to let everybody know again, your book is Conscious Living, Conscious Aging, Claiming the Gifts of Elderhood. And I would love it if you would come back and join us again for a deeper dive into some of these dimensions. One thing that you just touched on that I think can unfold into an entire dialogue unto itself is that, by definition, conscious aging is not a cruise control. And there are close associations that I would love to unpack with you related to challenges of spiritual bypassing and really maintaining presence and growth, which necessarily may involve navigating pain and navigating additional moments of discomfort. There's no final
Yes.
resolution, right? I would be grateful to be able to have you come back and talk about some of those.
Well, I'd be grateful to have that opportunity, Bob. I think we can go a lot further with this conversation. And I would add one thing, if I may, and that is that I really believe that in the times we're in now that are defined by chaos and crisis and darkness of every kind, I really believe that it is more important now than it's ever been, maybe. I don't know. It's more important that more and more of us grow into becoming true elders so that we can be the voice of wisdom. We can present a bigger picture perspective to the world around us. We could bring some more consciousness to a lot of the darkness that seems to be enveloping us these days. I think the role of elder is more important than ever for what we can contribute to the greater good now, for what we can contribute toward leaving a decent world for our descendants, and certainly for our own well-being in our later years. And so I invite everybody to really give some serious thought as to what does your aging mean to you? Are you aiming high? Are you aiming for anything? Is there a voice in you that's telling you that more is possible? And if there is, then do some exploration. My book is one way to proceed. There's a lot of good books, a lot of good resources, a lot of good teachers out there. Just begin to look if you feel that you're looking for something more empowering than most of what you see around you in the society that we live in.
Ron, thank you very much. If you're interested in learning more about the Center for Conscious Eldering, you can do so at centerforconsciouseldering.com,
Yeah.
where you can also get yourself a copy of Ron's truly remarkable book. And Ron, I look forward to having you back on the program again soon. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And thank you, Bob. I wish you well.
Likewise. And thank you all for listening. We'll be back again with another episode. Be well.